Well, welcome to our lecture on the neurology of emotion. Today we're going to look at the parts of the system of the central nervous system which are responsible for our experience of feelings. This includes positive feelings and also negative feelings, and also the kinds of feelings that we are required to respond to in the case of survival. For example, fright, if we see a predator, or if there is something in the environment that needs us to withdraw or escape from. So the neurology of emotion concerns those parts of the brain that are needed for the survival of a species. Now, in the case of the central nervous system, as we've seen many times, we've got several layers of structure. So we've got the neocortex, we've got the cerebellum, we've got the brain stem, and within the neocortex we have a number of structures that we're very familiar with already, such as the cingulate gyrus here, the corpus callosum, which is the bundle of white matter fibers that connects the left and the right hemispheres together. We've got some parts of the system here that are familiar from our work on the brain stem, the diencephalon, for example the thalamus, and we've got the mammillary body located here. And throughout this subcortical region that we're looking at, in the darker brown regions, we can use a term that we refer to as limbic to describe this constellation of structures in a category which happens to be associated with emotion, as well as many other processes, including memory. So let's look through each one of these and in turn get some idea of what the system might be engaged in. Let's start with the simpler area, the olfactory bulb. Now, this is a part of the limbic system, mostly because it is attached structurally in this brown structure to other parts of the subcortex that are quite far away. For example, the hippocampus, which is located here, the amygdala, which is located here. We've also got the fornix, which is located here, and the mammillary bodies, which, although close to the olfactory bulb in terms of physical distance, the functional relationship is really very far apart. So within the darker brown structures that we call the limbic system, we've got smell, olfactory bulb, which is purely a sensory component. So this is the sensation of odor. We've also got in the area that we call the hippocampus, those parts of the subcortex that are important for memory, particularly for learning new information. So we know from studies of the famous patient H.M., he was unable to learn new information because he had specific damage to the hippocampus. And we've also seen in the past some functional examination of the hypothalamus, which is located here, adjacent to the limbic structures, and the amygdala, which we have seen briefly, but is critical for what we think of as emotional response, particularly for the fight or flight response, fight or flight. And we believe that the amygdala has a fairly central role in the ability to allow a mammal and actually other invertebrates to quickly respond to a predator or danger in the environment, either by fighting with it or fleeing from it, fight or flight. So the amygdala is responsible, we think, for triggering an emotional response, and that affects the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And together with the olfactory bulb, the hippocampus, and the mammillary body, the fornix, we have what's called the limbic system. Notice here that in the limbic system we've got this, again, this kind of folding over shape, this convolution of structures, so that again we've got this cephalic structure that we keep seeing over and over again in the brain, where we've got a rounded shape. And one of the reasons for that is that these limbic structures, so-called limbic structures, are very primitive in the development of the human brain. That is, they develop very early, but they're also observed in lesser creatures. So phylogenetically, the limbic system is thought to be a very basic system that has been a part of the living creature for a very, very long time. In other words, the limbic system is necessary for survival and for the promotion of reproduction and the selfish gene, as we discussed in previous lectures. Now, within the sensory network of the limbic system, we have a number of functional layers that we think are important for developing an emotional response to, let's just take a very simple example, a predator in the environment. So all creatures have predators, even small cells that have no function apart from acting as a virus or a bacteria. All living creatures have predators. So there is a threat to the existence of all living cells. But of course humans are far more sophisticated than a single cell, and yet there is still the necessity to respond by withdrawing or attacking those predators in our environment. Now, one of the ways that it's thought to occur is through this circuit called the Papez circuit. The Papez circuit is actually originally attributed to a neuroscientist called Papez, who identified a number of different processes that we might experience in the withdrawal or flight response from a predator. So, for example, we've got beginning with a body sensory experience. That would be the perception of a predator through vision, or perhaps audition, or even through touch, but most critically through smell. Most creatures, for example dogs and many others, are acutely used to using a sense of smell to identify not just predators, but toxins, pathogens, unpleasant environmental stimuli that could threaten the existence of the creature. So smell has always been a very important sensory experience in the fight-flight response, the response to predation and danger, essentially. So the body sensory experience is the first layer, which of course, in the case of smell, is the olfactory bulb. And in the case of processing of the olfactory bulb stimuli, the odors that are presented to the nose, and the olfactory bulb receives that information. This is passed to the thalamus, which we've previously discussed, the thalamus being quite close to the olfactory bulb as it happens. That information is then presented to the hypothalamus, which we've also already discussed, and this is where the Papez circuit begins. So this is the area in the mammalian brain, and possibly other species too, that we see activity that triggers some kind of a response. Most often the bodily response to, let's say, danger through the odor of a predator would occur through flight. So the response would be escape. Sometimes there could be fight. That's another story that we won't go into. But the body response from recognition of a dangerous odor from a predator would then generate from the hypothalamus a body response which is flight. There's also other responses that could occur. In the case of, let's say, aquatic creatures, we might see an interesting adaptation, which is to become chameleons, that is, use camouflage. So if we had a coral, let's say, that was in danger of predation, it can instantly turn into a stone-like color through camouflage so that the predator will not attack it. So it doesn't move, but it doesn't actually fly, or there's no flight or escape, but it remains in situ, but it changes color so it disguises itself. So this is another type of body response that we think occurs via the hypothalamus. Now, interestingly, the hypothalamus is also connected in the Pepez circuit to the hippocampus, which is our memory for new information. So the hippocampus being a very basic structure for learning new material. And finally to the cingulate cortex, and this is where humans are different, we think, because not all creatures have a cingulate cortex, but many do have hippocampi, thalamus, hypothalamus. So we think what's unique for human emotion is the experience, that is the conscious experience of an emotion. And via the cingulate cortex, which is part of the Pepez circuit, we think there is a feed forward to the sensory cortex, which produces arousal that is interpreted as sweatiness, sweaty palms. So this is via the parasympathetic system, heart racing, heartbeat increasing. What else do we get? We get pupils dilating. So there's a number of different sensory responses to predation. And through the sensory cortex, we get in the humans an emotional experience that we call fear. We don't know if fear is occurring in dogs or other creatures. We can only interpret their mental state through observation, but certainly this is what we find in the human species.